So I'm Jeremy. Nice to meet you all. It's a little weird not seeing an audience, but I'll imagine your beautiful faces and turn up my volume as suggested. Is that better? Tifa? How's this? Great. So I love to cook. I love it. I love the fire. I love the improvisation behind cooking. I love trying new recipes and that there's always something new to learn. And so when I was growing up, the kitchen was kind of the social nexus of our house. So I'd get home every day from school, I'd unpack my book bag, and I'd sit down at the kitchen counter. We never sat at the dining room table, we sat at the kitchen counter, and I'd start doing my homework, and my mom would start cooking dinner. And I didn't know at the time, but after 10 years or however many years it was of doing that, I sort of absorbed a lot of what she was doing. And I don't know, I just looking back on it, I really appreciate how that is what brought our family together. And it was just sort of an intrinsic part of our household. So I got to college and I felt that I was missing some of that. The experience at the cafeteria, it wasn't the same. It wasn't, I don't know, it just wasn't the food that we had at home. So I made really good friends with the cafeteria staff. They were all Albanian, and I had a passion for Albanian music. I'm an accordion player, so we made friends, and they would sneak me ingredients, and I taught myself how to cook in college out of sort of the necessity of wanting to try really cool food and learn to do it. So you may ask, Jeremy, why are you talking about cooking right now? I came here to learn about sound design. For me, I think about this all the time. They're the same thing. They're both about how you curate ingredients, you combine them, you process them, you mix them together, taste it, adjust it, maybe add a little secret sauce, and ultimately transforming them into an entirely new experience that is then consumed by your audience. And ideally, hopefully, they leave the table feeling satisfied and wanting more. They're both infinite in possibility, and there's just always more to learn. I love that about music and sound design and cooking alike. You can never you can master aspects of it, but there's always more to learn about, always more to try. And so one thing though I should clarify is that when I say cooking is like sound design, I think it's important that I clarify what I mean by sound design, because so many people use the term in so many different ways. And I think for every person who encounters sound design, or every sound designer that you meet, they're going to have a little bit of a different understanding of what it might mean. So for me, and this is going to be different for whoever you ask, sound design really at heart is about making informed choices to further a story with sound. So that might mean the curation of music. It might mean adding sounds from the world to environment. It might just mean paying careful attention to what dialogue you're including in a story and what dialogue you aren't. It really any of that, but it's really just about making deliberate choices. And in order to make those choices, I think there's sort of a cross section of skill sets that go into that inform the choices that you make. So on the one hand, there's the technique. So you need to be able to execute the choices that you make. And so that involves a knowledge of sort of some combination of, audio editing, being able to cut up audio, mixing, knowing how to combine it, recording it, knowing how to capture it, synthesis if you want to make sounds from scratch. Maybe you're working with really old recordings and you want to be able to clean them up to make them more intelligible. Sometimes it requires a knowledge of sort of technical infrastructure, like the equipment that is involved in delivering the sounds that you're creating. So that's sort of one aspect. And then there's also a sense of composition. when I say that, I don't mean necessarily the limited scope of composition in a kind of traditional music composition sense, although you can certainly think of it that way. But I think of it as a kind of expanded view. So the idea of how you might organize sounds together, what sounds might fit with others, pacing, how those sounds occur over time, a sense of curation, choosing what sounds to use and what sounds not to use. And then finally, and super importantly, there's storytelling. You know, if we're making informed choices to further a story with sound, we have to understand the art of storytelling. And so that might involve having a vision for the way that you want to tell your story and being able to sort of picture it in your mind so you can execute it. A sense of collaboration, being able to work with other people and get on the same page about telling that story. Direction, being able to communicate your own ideas to other people. And this is one I think about a ton, is translation. So being able to talk about how sound might further a story without necessarily relying on a vocabulary of technical jargon. So being able to have human, normal, accessible conversations with people. And for me, sound design, and it can be different combinations of all these skills, but sound design is the kind of overlap of them. So with that in mind, I really think cooking is the same thing. And I think what we can do is we can think about what makes great cooking and use that as an exercise to help kind of guide some lessons in what might make some really good sound design. Cooking also relies on technique. You have to know your knife skills. You have to know how to use heat, have a knowledge of how to season things, food safety. You don't want people to throw up. Composition, you know, knowing how to plate your dish, pairing certain things with other things, planning your menu, a knowledge of different cuisines or seasonality. Storytelling is key to great cooking. What purpose does great cooking serve if not to bring people together for a story, to have conversation, foster community, share recipes with each other and whatnot? So with that in mind, I'm really excited. I've been thinking about this a ton. I'm just so excited to share with you some things that I've been thinking about that I've learned in this kitchen and apply to my sound design every day. So the first lesson is you have to taste the world. Before you even get started sound designing anything, the meals you cook benefit from the meals you eat. So it's really important to expose yourself to as many kinds of food as possible, because your work in the kitchen will draw from every experience you've had with food previously. So if you take a moment to recognize, what makes the experience of that $2 taco that you had at a bar on Saturday night, or remember what went into the chocolate at that terrible first date you had at a chocolate shop, or what made the experience of the fancy restaurant that your rich uncle took you to for your birthday, the company potluck, it can be anything. What made those good? What made those bad? All that feeds into your kind of your palette of experience that can then influence your own work. So as a podcaster and a sound designer, the first thing that I encourage people to do is go out and listen to the world. And of course, that means listen to other podcasts, focus on how they use sound, but also expand beyond that. Watch movies and really listen. How does the sound further the story? Go on a hike, listen. How do the birds react to your presence in the forest? How do they sound different after a rainstorm or in the morning versus the afternoon? How does your voice in a room, how does the room, that your voice occupies sort of influence the sound of your own voice? Does the character of your voice change when you're in your kitchen versus the classroom, a hallway, a garage, the forest, morning, night, humid environments, not humid environments? And so if you want to take this sort of a step further, there's a really amazing set of exercises called a sound education. And it's 100 exercises. It's written by R. Murray Schafer, who I could be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure he coined the term soundscape. He's the guy who invented that word. And it's a list of 100 listening exercises It doesn't require any special equipment or anything like that, just a notebook in your ears. And I really think if you were to go through those exercises, more than anything else, more than technical training, those can further your sound design just infinitesimally. So the next lesson from the kitchen is, if sound design is often about the sort of curation and composition of different sonic elements to make a whole, to make a new thing, a question I often get is, okay, where do I find those elements? I need to get my ingredients. They might be musical elements. They might be sound from the world that we know. They might be abstract sounds that, that sort of communicate different emotional feelings. They might be historical recordings, anything, but where do you get your ingredients? And so, like in the world of cooking, I think where you choose to get your ingredients really depends on what you're trying to make and the needs that you're trying to serve. There's no one-stop shop that I can refer you to. And so, sometimes you just need to eat. You need food fast. You need it conveniently. You need to work really quickly. And so you grab a frozen meal from the freezer. And there are plenty of sort of sound equivalents to this. There are a lot of websites that have just kind of prefab stock music or stock sound effects, stock soundscapes. They're oriented more towards sort of commercial video production and that kind of thing. So big stock sites like Pond5, Shutterstock, MusicBed, and these sites, often the quality isn't the best, like your frozen meal, but sometimes that's what you need. Sometimes you just need something quickly to lay in and you're good to go. Sometimes I use that stuff as temp material to try out ideas before I execute them and invest that time. But, there are other times that you just need to get a lot of basics at once. You might not know exactly what you want and you want to browse. You want some dependable ingredients to try out. So there are other sources. Personally, and I'm not endorsing this, but personally, I really like the APM music library for music, SoundSnap for sound effects, that both offer kind of a la carte music and sound effect options. And it's like a big box store. You can go and you can browse, you can find stuff, you can depend on it to be fairly high quality. But then sometimes you need something special, and you need something kind of unique, higher quality, and so you might go to the farmer's market, see what's in season. And in the sound design world, there are a number of kind of boutique marketplaces. So we can think of them as like independent growers who put a lot of time into a limited selection of high quality specialty ingredients. Sound designers like me who publish boutique libraries. So on the music end, places like Marmoset Music, which is commissioning work from working composers and musicians that isn't necessary. They're not necessarily kind of commercial composers, but they're real artists. A soundeffect.com is a wonderful marketplace of all sorts of boutique sound libraries. But what I want to say is that my absolute favorite thing to do is to forage for my own ingredients. So this is a hen of the woods mushroom I found, and some tortellini my friend and I made from it. And there's just something about foraging for your own ingredients that makes always, in my experience, for the most meaningful meal. You get a story out of it. It's really unique. The process of making it is special. And so for me as a sound designer, foraging for my own sounds is sort of brings just so much, not only more quality to what I'm working on, but so much more meaning to the experience of crafting whatever I'm working on. So wherever I go, I bring my recorder and I'm just recording the world as I encounter it. And, sometimes those recordings will sit on a hard drive for years, but they always find a place. And if you're looking to grow your skills as a sound designer, really the very first investment that I would recommend you make is in some means of collecting sounds around you. So that might be a recorder, just like this little, a Zoom or a sort of handy recorder. But really these days, everybody has a microphone on them. You have your phone, and really it's about just capturing the sounds around you. So, I would encourage you to do it, and not only to have those sounds for later use, but it makes makes you way more of the sounds around you, and it's a great way to learn how to listen to the world as well. Next lesson. Mise en place is French. It means everything in its own place, everything in its place. And from what I hear, I didn't go to culinary school, but from what I hear, it's the very first thing that you learn on day one of culinary school. And the idea behind this is that you're way more efficient in the kitchen. You cook a way better meal if you get all your ingredients situated ahead of time. They all have a dedicated spot. And so that way, you can have something on the burner and you don't need to worry about it burning while you're going to chop your onions and whatnot. Everything's ready to go. You know where everything is, and you can really focus on using it well and cooking it precisely and making the best meal you possibly can. And so I'm naturally not a very organized person at all. And when I started doing sound design, my sessions looked sort of like the equivalent of this. And it's really hard to cook a meal in a kitchen like this. You don't know where anything is. You're reaching for everything. The potatoes are burning on the stove. You're trying to chop the onion, and it's impossible. It's not impossible. You can cook a meal, but it creates all sorts of impositions. And so this is kind of the audio equivalent of really bad mise en place. You'll see there's tons of visual clutter. You'll see the tracks aren't named in a clear way. There's an offline file. For some reason, scene 4 comes after scene 5. There's all sorts of stray volume automation stuff on here. And I look at this and I don't know what's going on. I don't know what is where or where is what. And it's just way harder to work this way. And so even as a messy person, I have learned the hard lesson that if you invest some time in organizing your sound sessions, no matter what technology you're using to make them, be it Pro Tools or magnetic tape or anything in between, it ultimately allows you to work way more efficiently and faster because you know where everything is, work smarter, and it really, really, really does make your sound better because you can sort of understand where everything is and how it all works together, and it really does have a meaningful result on the end thing. And the added benefit for me that I think is really cool is it allows you visually to kind of zoom out and see the storytelling structure of your piece. You can see how much music there is where and that kind of thing. So, there's no right or wrong way to do this, but I would really encourage you to invest the 5 or 10 minutes it takes to create some consistent color coding, to use checkerboarding, which you can see up on the upper left-hand side of the screen. So sort of there, the host and the reporter are sort of ping-ponging back and forth, so you can clearly see who's talking when. Maybe if you're using sound effects, cascading them, so you can see that sort of in the middle, the blue regions are kind of, as they progress over time, they're moving one track down and one track down. And so you can really sort of see where everything is, what it's doing. And then, of course, very clear labeling. I know what every track is. I have my sound effects tracks, music tracks, guest tracks, reporter track, post track. And I guarantee you, it takes 5 minutes and it makes everything sound way, way better. But I also think you shouldn't be too organized in that mise en place serves to organize your meal, but we should talk about the pantry. And for me, you can see over here, I like my pantry to be kind of organized enough that I know where to find ingredients, but chaotic enough to sort of serve as inspiration and promote discoveries that I might not otherwise make. So for instance, one example might be if I'm reaching here for my cumin, I might, along the way, the cumin isn't in its own dedicated place, and it's with all this other stuff, and I might see next to it that there's some cinnamon and some lentils up there, some sesame seeds over there, some tamarind over there, and maybe it might give me some inspiration for ideas of components to put into my meal that I wouldn't otherwise have just sort of brainstormed. Another really good example, one day I was making focaccia, and I reached for my olive oil. Yeah, I keep my olive oil right here. Keep olive oil, canola, fish sauce, sesame oil. So I reached for my olive oil, and I poured it into my focaccia dough, and then I realized it was fish sauce. And that's something that I would never, ever do, and it seems kind of gross, but actually, I went through and baked it, because why not? I didn't want to throw it out. It was actually kind of good. It was like an anchovy-flavored pizza. It was good. I never would have thought of doing that had everything been perfectly arranged. So it can really encourage discovery. So the same thing happens all the time when I do sound design, in that I might be looking for one kind of music and encounter another that I never even would have thought of trying, and it's perfect. So a little bit of chaos can promote really nice discoveries. It's like you can't find treasure unless you have to dig a little bit and get a little messy. There's another important one. The best knife doesn't make the best meal, in that you can have all the fancy kitchen gadgets you want. You can have a sous vide machine, fancy Japanese knives, food processor, Instapot, all this and that, but it doesn't make a good meal. And so for me, I think it's better to focus on a few tools. They don't need to be the best tools in the world, but really learn how to use them. In my kitchen, I depend on my knife, and I depend on my mortar and pestle. And so in audio, it's the same. And that's only to say that I think there's a real culture in sound of fetishizing and getting really obsessive about gear. And that's not necessarily always useful. You just need a few things, learn how to use them, and it's about your ideas, and it's about the story that you're trying to tell. On that front, you can't season a meal until you start cooking, and that you can think about what you want to eat, you can choose a recipe, you can describe it a ton, but language will never really capture all the nuances of its taste. And every time you cook it, it's going to be a little different. It's going to have different needs. A lot of times I get overwhelmed when I'm trying to think of the very first way to start a project. There's so much to do, so much to add. And I found that it's like really important just to start doing something. Like, you won't really begin the process until you have something to reflect on and to edit and to revise. So I would definitely encourage you to put an idea down on the paper, if you will, and then you can go from there. That's sort of like the best first step that you can do. It can be good, it can be bad, but as long as you have something, then you have a starting place and a place to go. It's like you can't make adjustments and know exactly how much salt is going to be needed in a dish until you start making the dish and then taste it, and then you can start to adjust. And then finally, there's plating. And so a plate is composed of many, many things, but it's important to think that good plating also can include blank space. The plate doesn't need to just be piled with food. And on that front, I think silence is one of the most powerful choices that a sound designer can have. Like, we often feel obligated to add and add and add and add, but it's a totally deliberate and very powerful choice to underscore certain stories or parts of stories with a really careful use of silence. Silences between, silences underneath, and going back to how I think of sound design is about making deliberate choices. If you're making a deliberate choice of not putting sound under a certain scene, not adding music, that is a very, very valid and a very powerful tool that we have as sound designers. Similarly, sometimes when I get stuck, rather than thinking about what I can add where, I try to think in terms of negative space. So I invert what I'm doing, and I try to think about where can I remove sound to highlight parts of the story. If there's music playing throughout the story, and then there's music stops, and suddenly we just hear the human voice, that emphasizes a point, and it's a really powerful composition and underscore tool. So I think the thing that I love the most with cooking and sound design is that it can be an act of collaboration. I think cooking or sharing a meal with another person is like one of the most meaningful and intimate human gestures you can have. And so I'd say that as you embark on making your meals, sound designing your pieces, the way in which it can be most satisfying and most fun and most rewarding is if you bring other people into your kitchen, collaborate, share your process, find people who maybe have complementary skills and experience and points of view to yours, and be generous to them in your kitchen. And while our projects come and go and they start and they end, if you have some good collaborators and have fun in the kitchen making stuff, the process of cooking or the process of sound design can be a really fun and joyful activity, and that's what I love about it. So with that, I will take your questions. I'm really eager to talk about what you want to talk about ultimately. So thank you.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed the way you kind of put it together, and it works really well with food, and it makes it like much easier to understand. We do have a number of questions for you.
Great.
First, Yagnesh was wondering just how often you record your own sounds.
I try to do it as much as I possibly can, and so I really love biking, and so I usually combine it with my bike rides. So when I'm going biking, I bring a recorder. I actually, in my case, have some microphones mounted to the handlebars of my bike, and I find that when I'm biking around New York City or wherever I am, I might encounter an interesting sound or a sonic environment. I'll stop for 5 minutes and record it, and then move on. And I'll get home and I'll label it, and I'll put it on a hard drive, and it'll sit there. Maybe I'll use it the next day on something, or maybe it'll sit there for 3 years, and then something will come along that's perfect. I also love recording when I travel, so when I'm going to other sorts of places. So the answer is all the time. And for me, it's the thing that, like, when I think about how I continue to grow and grow as a sound designer, that's the real act that promotes that growth. Because while you're recording, you're also noticing things and listening, and sort of time can stop, your stresses can go away. But yeah, all the time, and you should too.
Sorry, Yagnesh was just saying, do you mind turning up your sound a little bit?
Oh, sorry. My bad. I'm standing kind of far from the mic.
Sounds good. Kind of following that though, can you tell us a bit about how you or your process to kind of remove noise from your sound clips?
So we're in an era where there are all sorts of very exciting high-tech technologies that exist to remove noise. There are tools like Isotope, which is Isotope RX is kind of the industry standard. There are other tools. There's Cedar, which is used like by the FBI to clean up evidence, and there's some independent companies. There's a tool called Bruce Free that is a Swedish noise reduction tool. But ultimately, I would say before you look to those solutions, the two best things you can do is, first of all, do everything you can to mitigate noise at the source when you're recording. So that means not being embarrassed when you're conducting an interview to stop the interview and tell your subject, hey, I'm hearing a lot of your refrigerator. Would it be okay if we unplug it for 15 minutes? Or, hey, like, I know it's hot outside, but the AC is on, and you're really going to sound way better if we just turn that off for a minute. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is a kind of old school editorial approach, in that sometimes removing all the noise sounds pretty unnatural. And sometimes it can be better to use really traditional, simple audio editing techniques to just make sure the noise is consistent. So as you're editing your material, making sure that the noise doesn't suddenly cut in and out and in and out, and a consistent experience. And then our ear just sort of becomes accustomed to it, and on a cognitive level, it kind of fades away to the background. So I would always encourage you to do those two things, and then you can move on to some of the more fancy technologies, and you'll find that they have to do a lot less work and add a lot less artificial coloring to your sound. when you turn to them.
We've also got a great question from KL about what does your work process look like for kind of each show that you do? Where do you start when designing for production?
Yeah, for every project it's different, but the one thing that I can say is one thing that I love doing and I find to be really, really beneficial before I start actually getting hands-on on a project is having a conversation about what the needs of the project will be. And so the challenge with that, and I actually see this as one of my primary jobs as a sound designer, the challenge with that is when you're speaking with your collaborators, the kind of nuance of emotion that sound can communicate comes with a trade-off, which is that it's really hard to talk about sound in clear, consistent language. So you, Grace, might say, hey, Jeremy, I really want the sound to be nostalgic for this episode of my podcast. And your idea of what might be nostalgic may be very, very different than my idea or experience of what something nostalgic is. So one of the first things that I love to do is sit down around some common audio examples. So I'll make a playlist, usually no more than 6 tracks. Some might be music, some might be recordings of the world that I've made, some might be references to other storytelling. And it's not an audition. We're not saying, okay, we're going to use this and this, and we're not going to use this and that. But we use it to kind of create a Rosetta Stone where when you say nostalgic, you can say, oh, I want it to be nostalgic like the thing that I'm hearing in this example. And then as a sound designer, I can recognize sort of what sonic or musical elements are making up that sound that you're describing and you associate with nostalgia. And then I can use the word nostalgia and I can be confident that we're talking about the same thing. And generally when I start processes with that or some variant of that process, they go very smoothly. And when I forget to do that, sometimes they go not so smoothly because we've been talking about 2 different things the whole time and I execute my version of something and it doesn't match what you were anticipating. So
there's a really nice follow-up question here from Tina about what are some key considerations for producers to keep in mind for terms that they can provide for sound designers, and how is that practically organized? Then scripts, separate folders, or Slack conversations?
I would say if you're working with a sound designer who you trust, keeping the conversation to goals about what you want the audience to come away feeling, what you want your story to communicate, rather than proposing technical solutions, is generally a very good way to work. Sometimes producers will offer technical solutions or feel obligated almost to offer technical solutions when they might not be necessarily the kind of ideal way to solve for the goal that you're trying to achieve. So if you have a good sound designer who's like willing to talk to you about story and willing to talk to you about emotion and not get bogged down in like this model of that compressor and all this sort of like technical distraction, I think that's the ideal way to collaborate.
That's really interesting. We also have a great question from Yagnesh again. Do you have an affinity for certain sounds or effects for particular situations, or do you like to switch it up every time? And I would almost add to that, how do you kind of maintain novelty when you're as you're moving through projects?
Yeah. So I definitely have an affinity for certain sounds. There are certain sounds that I just personally like, and that's my own tastes. I love the sound of bell buoys in New York Harbor. I love elks bugling, all sorts of things. But ultimately, the sounds that I use in projects are always sounds that I feel are going to serve that story. So I'd say it's more of a switch it up every time situation. Now, of course, I draw from my experience, so they're often often I get similar requests, and I know what has worked in the past and go for that. But I generally just think the best sound is whatever sound serves the story. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that.
Kind of following that up,
Yeah.
how do you, well, I've lost this question, but how do you organize all your sounds? And I almost wonder, you talking about like feelings, do you organize them like that? How do you keep track of such a like diverse sounds you can potentially include in a project?
So for a very long time, I just kept them in a kind of very organic hierarchy of folders. So you can only think you can think of it kind of like a Dewey Decimal System for sound. So I had a folder of animals, and in the animals, I had a folder of birds, and within the birds, I had a folder of raptors, and within the folder of raptors, I had a folder of eagles. And I would just include enough information in the file names and search just with like my operating system's native search thing. As I grew to get more sounds, that became slightly unwieldy and a little slow, and it was slowing me down. And so there are a number of pretty sophisticated database programs that folks use to organize a very when you have a lot of sounds, it allows you to access them quickly and sort them according to all sorts of metadata, whether it be location or the type of mic that it was recorded with or categories. The one thing that I should shout out is that there's a new initiative that I was very tangentially involved in called the Universal Category System, UCS. And it was developed by a very, very talented sound designer named Tim Nielsen, who works at Skywalker Sound, which is sort of the premier sound design studio in the world. And it serves to be a kind of mutually agreed upon taxonomy of sounds of those categories, because the problem was every sound designer was using different categories to organize their sounds. And when we trade them back and forth, it is very time consuming to sort of recategorize them. So it's supposed to serve as a lingua franca of sound effects organization. And you can check that out if you just Google Universal Category System sound effects. And they have a number of resources that even if you don't have one of these database programs, you can like download a folder hierarchy that you can fill in yourself. And there's all sorts of cool stuff around that. It's very, very cool.
Cool. We have a great question from Aaron. How do you maintain a balance between novelty and maintaining a consistent kind of brand for your program or podcast?
Sure. So I like to think in vocabularies a lot. So in that for a certain brand or a certain podcast or something like that, I might, rather than starting by just designing a set of sounds, I might start off by designing a set of rules or limiting principles that are going to guide what kind of sounds go into that project. So for instance, I did a project with Google that was all formed around a kind of mixtape concept. So all the sounds that went into that were either archival cassette tape recordings, or I did a ton of original recording of all sorts of cassette decks and analog technology. And then by drawing from that material that was constrained within certain sounds, it is both novel in that it's sort of very original and very consistent, but also sort of provides a strong like sort of identity or whatever, sonic identity to that specific project, because all the sounds kind of are of the same quote unquote vocabulary. So I don't know. I don't really think about novelty that much. I just think about, if I need to serve. So right now I'm working on a sort of satirical comedy piece, and in a weird way, it's important not to use novelty on that, because we're trying to make all sorts of cultural references, and so I'm actually going for tropes. So it totally depends.
Interesting, really interesting. Carla has a really interesting comment question. I have a bit of a theory about the bar for good sound currently has been slightly diminished because of the pandemic. A lot of the times on podcasts or on the radio, people sound like they're in a tunnel because they don't have a great mic or are muffled because of a mask. But I imagine that won't always be the case. But do you have any tips for maximizing or improving sound quality when we are a bit compromised right now?
Yeah. I think you're 100% right. Like, definitely the bar has been lowered, but maybe that's okay. Because, like, the goal is to tell a captivating story. And if your story is captivating, and as long as it's intelligible, that's like, there are all sorts of subconscious elements where you want the story to be comfortable to listen to and not be grating and all that. But in terms of improving the sound of things right now, I'd say just trust your gut. Can you understand it? Are you drawn into the story? If you're not, and you think the sound might be an element contributing to that, then you probably need to make some improvements. One thing is, in a weird sense right now on a technology level, because a lot of people, so a key part of recording sound isn't only the sound of the thing that you're recording, but the sound of the environment that it's in. So for instance, my voice right now is influenced, it's bouncing off all this stuff around me and going into the mic. And so weirdly, as a result, sometimes higher end mics tend to be more sensitive. And so they tend to pick up more of those reflections. I might be facing that problem right now when it's sort of low. And so interestingly, they're microphones, they're condenser microphones, which are more sensitive. And then there are dynamic microphones, which might have a reputation as being kind of quote unquote lower end, but in a way, they're way more suitable for the situation right now, because by being less sensitive, you have to be closer to them. And being by closer to them, they're picking up more of your voice and less of the crap around the room. So that's one thing you might want to look into. I know Alex is doing a session where he'll talk a little more about that later.
Do you have any sound composition pet peeves?
Probably. The joke is always on podcasts, MIDI marimba. Like there's certain kinds of music that tend to find themselves in under podcasts for one reason or another. You know, I think maybe one pet peeve of mine is that sometimes under podcasts you tend to hear the same, and I mean literally the same music over and over again, because people are drawing from the Free Music Archive, which is a really incredible resource of free music. But it is a little bit of a you get what you pay for situation. And that's not to say I think that people should be, that's not to like not recognize that people have a budget to fit. But, you know, everybody knows a musician 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from you. So I would encourage you in those situations to, you know, reach out and find somebody who can help you. And it's going to be a way more satisfying experience. And it's not going to sound like everything else because it's literally the same thing. And so I think there are other solutions around there, or using like old archival sources or learning how to make stuff yourself, you know, lots of choices.
That's a great suggestion. We definitely have fallen into that a little bit for sure.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
I also have a question. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what it's like working for Radiolab or working with Radiolab.
Mm-hmm. Radiolab's a really unique experience and really special because the producers on Radiolab all have a really incredible kind of musical intuition. So a lot, you know, on a lot of other productions that I've worked on, I'm the guy who people go to and they say, okay, sound design this. And on Radiolab, there's more of an element of collaboration and sort of back and forth, because all the producers have, you know, one producer sings in a choir and another producer is really into like electronic music. We have a producer who's really into experimental cassette tape music. And so even if they're not necessarily kind of trained composers with a capital C, they're all amazing, brilliant composers. And so I'd say that's like one of the most unique things about working there. And one of the major pluses is that people are able to kind of, if they're not writing the music that is going under their piece, they're at least always able to use music as a means of communicating what they want rather than struggling to find language. There's a sort of shorthand. So they might add a little music under their piece that serves to indicate what they are going for. And then I'll take it further because they have that, it's not even skill, but it's the confidence that comes from just being around music all the time. And it's not that they have any, it's not like they're notating anything or anything like that. It's just like they're around music, they're immersed in it all the time. And so we can use that as a language to communicate.
That's really cool. I had one more question, I think, and then that's our last question, unless I've missed one. But I was wondering what kind of considerations you take into account when you're choosing whether or not to work on a project.
The classic, so the advice that I got on that was you can think of projects in terms of having financial value. So this is work, and if they pay well, you can think of projects as having an amazing story. So a story that you're really personally invested in and really interested in telling. And you can think of projects as having amazing collaborators who you're excited to work with. And the rule that I was taught is you should take a project if it has two of those three things. So if it pays really well, or not, if it pays fairly, let's say, and it has good collaborators, maybe the story isn't something that you're like personally interested in, but then it's probably going to be a good experience for you. If it has great collaborators and is a story that speaks to you amazingly, maybe the pay isn't as well as you would like, you're still going to have a great experience out of that. If the collaborators are maybe some corporate entity that aren't the most exciting bunch in the world, but the pay is good and the story is really cool, you should probably take it. And then, once in a blue moon, you get one that has all three, which is always really exciting. I can think of like 4 or 5 projects that I've had like that. And those are great. So that's the experience that I got. And I think you just get an intuition for what initial conversations lead to really satisfying projects, and you just learn from your experience.
That's great advice. I have one more question, actually.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you ever collaborate with other sound designers and what that looks like.
It's very rare that I get to collaborate with other sound designers. And that's one of the things that makes Radiolab so amazing. Like I'm one of several sound designers at Radiolab, and we can trade things back and forth. It's rare because usually as the sound designer on the project, you're the sound designer on a project. And so you're not really going to be interacting with others. I am working on a show right now where I was able to bring on a friend of mine who I deeply respect his skills. He's way better than me at a lot of things. And so I needed support on the show. So I brought him on and we're sharing it essentially. He's doing more dialogue. I'm doing more sound effects. And that has been just like such an amazingly rewarding experience. So when I have the chance to work with other sound designers, it's amazing. I love it. But it's very rare that I get to do that. In film, it's more common. In film, like sound on a film has more kind of delegated, defined roles. So I might be the sound effects editor. There might be a separate dialogue editor, a separate mixer, a Foley artist. But weirdly, you don't always have a ton of interaction with them because they're off doing their thing while you're off doing your thing. But when you get to collaborate, it's amazing.
Cool. So I think we will end it there. Thank you again for such a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye.